The bleach bit at the skin of her knuckles, a familiar, stinging scent that clung to her clothes and hair long after her shift ended. Noelle kept her head down, her focus narrowed to the endless expanse of white marble floor. Here, in this silent palace of glass and steel overlooking Tokyo, invisibility was a survival skill. The other maids, older women with tight faces and fearful eyes, had taught her that on her first day. Do your work. Do not make eye contact. Do not speak unless spoken to. And never, ever draw the attention of the man who owned it all, Mr. Tanaka. She'd never seen him, not really. Just a ghost in a tailored suit glimpsed through a closing door, or the low rumble of his voice from the study she was never to enter while it was occupied. He was a creature of myth and shadow, the source of the thick, oppressive silence that permeated the estate. The August sun was a merciless hammer outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. It beat down on the meticulously sculpted gardens, wilting the prize-winning roses and shimmering off the koi pond. And out in that heat, another fixture of the estate worked in silence. The gardener. He was there every day, from sunrise until the light failed. He was older, she guessed, with a lean, wiry strength that spoke of a life of physical labor. His skin was tanned to a deep bronze, and his hands, when she caught a glimpse of them, were calloused and stained with earth. He never spoke, not to the other staff who hurried past him, and certainly not to the glamorous, sharp-edged women who sometimes drifted through the gardens on Mr. Tanaka's arm, their laughter like breaking glass. Today, one of those women, a model named Emmy with eyes as cold as the diamonds on her fingers, stood on the terrace, complaining into her phone. The gardener was working nearby, trimming the hedges with a pair of shears that moved with a quiet, hypnotic rhythm. Snap. Slice. Snap. It's simply unacceptable, Emmy said, her voice sharp enough to cut. She gestured vaguely in his direction. The noise is infuriating. She snapped her fingers, a sound like a whip crack. You. Stop that. The gardener didn't flinch. He finished the line he was on, the shears making one final, precise cut. Then he slowly straightened, turning his head. He didn't look at her, but past her, toward the distant city skyline. Emmy's face tightened with fury at being ignored. She strode over, her silk dress whispering against the stone. Are you deaf? I told you to stop. She kicked at the small pile of trimmings he gathered, scattering the green leaves across the pristine white stone. Noelle, watching from the window she was meant to be polishing, felt a knot of anger tighten in her stomach. The gardener simply looked down at the scattered leaves, his expression unreadable. He bent, slowly, and began to gather them again, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Emmy gave a disgusted scoff and swept back inside, leaving the scent of expensive perfume and casual cruelty in her wake. An hour later, the sun was at its apex. The heat radiating from the stone terrace was a physical force. Noelle was refilling her cleaning bucket when she saw him. The gardener was still there, now weeding a flower bed, his back bowed to the sun. His shirt was soaked through with sweat, clinging to his frame. He paused for a moment, pressing a hand to the small of his back and looking toward a spigot on the wall, but he didn't move toward it. He just wiped his brow with the back of a dirty glove and bent back to his task. Something in her snapped. It was a small, quiet rebellion against the cold, calculated cruelty of this place. She looked around. The kitchens were empty, the head cook out for deliveries. The other maids were on the upper floors. No one was watching. Acting before she could think better of it, Noelle went to the staff kitchen, took a clean glass from the rack, and filled it with ice and water from the dispenser. The glass was cool and heavy in her hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pushed open the heavy glass door to the terrace. The wall of heat hit her. She walked across the stone, her worn sneakers silent. He didn't seem to hear her approach. She stopped a few feet away from him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He froze. For a long moment he didn't move. Then he slowly rose to his feet, turning to face her. Up close, he wasn't as old as she'd thought. His face was weathered, lined by the sun, but his eyes were dark and startlingly intense. They weren't the dull, tired eyes of a man beaten down by a life of labor. They were sharp, intelligent, and watchful. A faint scar, a thin white line, disappeared into the collar of his worn work shirt. He said nothing. He just watched her, his stillness a palpable force. Noelle's courage faltered. She felt foolish, exposed. She held out the glass. I thought you might be thirsty, she stammered. It's so hot out here. His gaze dropped from her face to the glass of water in her hand. Condensation beaded on its surface, dripping onto the hot stone. He looked at it as if he'd never seen such a thing before. Then his eyes lifted back to hers. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the hum of a distant cicada. Finally, he reached out. He pulled off his soiled glove, revealing a hand that was calloused but impeccably clean underneath. His fingers were long and steady as they closed around the glass, his skin brushing hers for a fleeting second. The contact was like a tiny spark of electricity. He lifted the glass and drank, draining it in 3 long, slow swallows. His throat worked, the movement stark and strangely intimate. He lowered the empty glass, his eyes never leaving hers. "Thank you," he said. His voice was not what she expected. It was low and raspy from disuse, but it held a deep, resonant quality, a quiet authority that sent a shiver down her spine. She just nodded, unable to speak. He held the glass out for her to take. As she reached for it, a door slammed open inside the house. The head of security, a stern man named Kenjiro, stood there, his face pale. "Sir," Kenjiro said, his voice tight with urgency. "There is a problem in the study. You are needed." "Sir." Noelle's blood went cold. The gardener's entire demeanor shifted. The tired slump of his shoulders vanished. He stood taller, a sudden, chilling aura of command settling over him like a shroud. He handed the glass to Noelle, his eyes still locked on hers, and then turned. He moved with a fluid grace that was utterly at odds with the stooped laborer she had seen moments before. He walked past Kenjiro and into the house without a backward glance, his dirt-stained work boots leaving faint prints on the polished marble. Noelle stood frozen on the terrace, the empty glass clutched in her hand, the sun beating down on her head. The world had just tilted on its axis, and she had the terrifying feeling she was about to fall. Later that night, the call came. One of the junior maids shook her awake in her small room in the staff wing. "Mrs. Abe wants you," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. In the main study, "There's been a spill." A spill. The word was a sterile, flimsy curtain thrown over something horrible. Noelle pulled on her uniform, her hands trembling. The main house was deathly quiet. Mrs. Abe, the severe, iron-fisted housekeeper, met her at the study door. Her face was ashen. "You will clean it. You will not speak of what you see to anyone. Do you understand?" Noelle nodded, her throat too dry for words. Mrs. Abe pushed the door open and nudged her inside, closing it softly behind her. The room smelled of copper and cigar smoke. It was a beautiful room, lined with books and dark wood, but Noelle's eyes were fixed on the floor. A priceless Persian rug was soaked with a dark, spreading stain. In the center of it lay a man in a rumpled suit, his eyes open and empty. And standing by the massive mahogany desk, calmly wiping a spot of blood from his cufflink, was the gardener. He was no longer in his work clothes. He wore a black suit of such exquisite tailoring it seemed molded to his body. His hair was damp, combed back from his face. He was clean, polished, and absolutely lethal. He was Akio Tanaka. He looked up as she entered, and the breath caught in her lungs. The intense, watchful eyes were the same, but now they were set in the face of a predator. 2 other men in suits stood silently against the wall, their faces like stone masks. "Leave us," Mr. Tanaka said, his voice the same low, resonant timbre she'd heard in the garden. It was not a request. The 2 men bowed low and exited the room, their movements silent and efficient. Mrs. Abe was gone. The door clicked shut, leaving Noelle alone with him and the body. He watched her, his head tilted slightly. He held up a hand, gesturing to the bucket and cloths she was clutching. "You are here for the spill." She could only nod, her knuckles white on the handle of the bucket. He took a step toward her, moving with that same predatory grace. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough that she could smell the faint, clean scent of expensive soap and something else, something like cedar and cold steel. "I know who you are," he said, his voice soft, almost conversational. It was more terrifying than if he had shouted. "You're Noelle, 18 years old. You sent half of your wages back to your mother and sister in America. You have been working here for 6 months. You are quiet, efficient, and invisible." He paused, his dark eyes boring into hers. "Or so I thought." He took another step. "Today in the garden," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, "you did something no one else in this house has done. You showed kindness to a man you believed to be beneath you." He looked from her face down to the floor, at the dead man. "This man," he said, his voice hardening, "was my cousin. He believed he was above me. He sold information to my enemies. He was loud, inefficient, and very, very visible." He looked back at her. The silence in the room was a living thing, pressing in on her, stealing her breath. She felt pinned by his gaze, a butterfly under glass. "Now I have a problem, Noelle," he said softly. "You have seen my face. You have seen my work. And you brought me water when I was thirsty." He smiled, but it was a chilling, humorless expression. It did not reach his eyes. "That makes you a complication." He dismissed the cleaning. Instead, he had Kenjiro escort her from her small room in the staff wing to a guest suite on the 3rd floor of the main house. It was a gilded cage, larger than the entire apartment she'd grown up in, with a silk-draped bed and a balcony overlooking the city. "For your safety," Kenjiro had said, his face impassive. She knew it was for his. She was a witness, a loose thread he needed to keep hold of. The days that followed were a surreal blur. She was no longer a cleaner. She was a presence. She ate her meals in her room, brought on a tray by a maid who wouldn't meet her eyes. Sometimes, Akio would summon her. She would sit on a silk chair in his study, the same study, the rug now gone, replaced by gleaming, polished hardwood, while he took meetings. Men in dark suits would file in, bow, and speak in low, urgent tones about territory and shipments and debts. They would slide glances at her, their eyes full of suspicion and confusion. Who was this young black woman, dressed in the simple clothes she'd arrived in, sitting in the heart of their empire? Akio never introduced her. He never explained her presence. He simply let her exist in his orbit, a silent observer. And she watched him. She saw the surgical precision with which he ran his organization. He was a master of strategy, his mind always 3 steps ahead. He spoke less than anyone in the room, but controlled everything with a quiet word, a subtle gesture, a look. The casual violence she'd glimpsed that night was the foundation of it all, an ever-present threat that kept his world in order. One evening, a rival clan, the Hashimotos, made a move. A shipment was intercepted. One of Akio's men was killed. The news came via a grim-faced Kenjiro. The air in the study grew thick with menace. Akio said nothing for a long time. He simply stood by the window, looking out at the glittering expanse of Tokyo. His stillness was more terrifying than any rage. Later, when the house was quiet, Noelle was tasked with bringing him a pot of tea. She found him not in the study, but in a small, private sitting room she'd never been in before. The door was ajar. He was sitting in an armchair, his back to her, staring at something in his hands. She hesitated, ready to retreat, but a soft sound from within, a barely audible sigh, made her pause. She pushed the door open a fraction more. On a table beside him sat a small, framed photograph. It was old, the colors slightly faded. It showed a younger Akio, his face softer, a ghost of a real smile on his lips. Beside him was a woman with kind eyes and a cascade of dark hair. He must have sensed her presence. He didn't turn, but his voice, low and rough, filled the small room. Her name was Hannah. Noelle stood frozen in the doorway. "She was my wife," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. The Hashimoto clan, they wanted to send me a message. They used her. He finally turned his head, and in the dim light, she saw an ocean of pain in his eyes, a deep, ancient wound that his power and wealth could never heal. A vulnerability he kept hidden from the world. I was not yet the head of the family. I was not strong enough. I could not protect her. That is a shame I will carry forever. He looked away, back at the photograph. I learned then that loyalty cannot be bought. It must be tested. Kindness is a currency more rare and valuable than gold. He was talking about the garden, about the glass of water. He was explaining why she was here, in this room, breathing his air. He was testing her. The Hashimoto attack came 2 nights later. Akio was dining at a private restaurant in Ginza, a place he supposedly owned and controlled. He'd brought her with him. She didn't know why. Perhaps to see if she would break. She sat opposite him at a small table in a secluded room, the food on her plate untouched. The first sound was a muffled crack, followed by the tinkle of shattering glass from the front of the restaurant. Akio didn't even flinch. He was on his feet in an instant, his hand grabbing her arm, pulling her from her chair. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice a low, urgent command. The world erupted into chaos. Gunshots, screams, the splintering of wood. Akio moved through it like a phantom. He pulled her along, his body a solid shield in front of hers. He never seemed to panic. His movements were economical, precise, deadly. He took a gun from an ankle holster, the motion so smooth it was almost invisible. They were in a narrow hallway leading to the kitchens when 2 men blocked their path. They were Hashimoto soldiers, their faces twisted in grimaces of effort. Noelle had a clear chance. To her left was another door, slightly ajar, leading to an alley. She could run, disappear into the night, leave this world of blood and violence behind forever. But then she saw it. A third man, emerging from a side alcove. Akio was focused on the 2 in front. He hadn't seen him. The man raised his gun. "Akio," she screamed, the name feeling foreign and yet perfectly natural on her tongue. He reacted instantly, shoving her hard against the wall as he spun. A bullet tore through the sleeve of his jacket, grazing his arm. He fired twice, 2 clean, sharp reports, and the third man crumpled to the ground. The other 2, startled, were dispatched with the same brutal efficiency. It was over in seconds. The hallway was suddenly silent, filled with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Akio stood over the bodies, breathing heavily, the gun still steady in his hand. Blood was seeping through his jacket, a dark stain on the expensive fabric. She could still run. The alley door was right there. Freedom was 3 steps away. Instead, she pushed herself off the wall and went to him. "You're hurt," she said, her voice shaking. She reached into the pocket of her simple dress and pulled out the clean, folded handkerchief she always carried. Without thinking, she began to press it against the wound on his arm, her small act a mirror of his men's blind loyalty. She had made her choice. She was staying. He watched her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Kenjiro and other men appeared, securing the area, their voices low and urgent. But Akio didn't seem to notice them. His focus was entirely on her small hands pressing a piece of cloth to his bleeding arm. Back at the mansion, the house doctor had come and gone, leaving Akio's arm stitched and bandaged. He'd dismissed everyone, including Kenjiro. Now, it was just the 2 of them in his vast, marble-clad bathroom. The air was sterile, smelling of antiseptic. She was helping him into a clean shirt, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. The silence was deafening. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She was acutely aware of the hard muscle under her hands, the faint scent of cedar and smoke that seemed to cling to his skin. He stopped her, his hand closing over hers. His touch was surprisingly gentle. "Why didn't you run?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. "You had the chance." She looked up, meeting his intense gaze in the mirror. She saw her own reflection, a young woman a world away from home, her eyes wide with a fear and a fascination she couldn't name. She saw his reflection behind hers, powerful, dangerous, and inexplicably tied to her. She couldn't find the words to answer, because she didn't know herself. Was it fear? Was it shock? Or was it something else, something that had taken root in the garden under the hot sun, something that recognized the man beneath the monster? The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the unspoken truth of her choice. She had stayed. And in his world, that was a vow more binding than any contract. He began to trust her in small, incremental ways. He had her organize his papers, her quiet competence a soothing presence in his violent world. He asked her opinion on the design for a new restaurant front, his head tilted as he listened, truly listened, to her thoughts on color and light. The clan members watched this evolution with a mixture of fear and awe. The invisible cleaner was becoming something else. Emmy, the cruel model, had been dismissed weeks ago, sent away with a quiet finality that brooked no argument. Noelle was the only woman who now occupied the space beside him. The war with the Hashimoto clan escalated. It was no longer about territory. It had become personal. They saw Noelle not as a servant, but as a symbol, a repeat of the past he could not protect. They saw her as his weakness. The trap was laid with brutal cleverness. A supposedly neutral meeting on neutral ground. Akio knew it was a risk, but backing down was not in his nature. He took Noelle with him, a decision Kenjiro had argued against. She is safest here, the old soldier had insisted. Nowhere is safe for her anymore, Akio had replied, his voice flat. The only safe place for her is by my side. The meeting was in an old warehouse by the docks. The air smelled of salt and rust. The moment they stepped inside, the trap was sprung. The steel doors slammed shut, and the warehouse was flooded with Hashimoto soldiers. The ensuing fight was a maelstrom of violence. Akio moved through it like the god of death, a blur of controlled fury. But they were outnumbered. For a terrifying moment, Noelle saw him go down, a pained grunt forced from his lips as the butt of a rifle caught him in the ribs. He wasn't shot, but he was stunned on one knee, gasping for air. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. It was a feeling so potent it eclipsed her own fear. In that instant she understood. His survival had become entwined with her own. One of the Hashimoto men saw Akio falter. He broke from the main fight, a grin of triumph on his face, and came for her. He saw her as the prize, the final insult to his enemy. He reached for her, his hands like claws. Noelle's world narrowed to that leering face, the smell of his sweat, the glint of the knife in his hand. Her survival instinct, honed by a life of being overlooked and underestimated, took over. She was not a fighter. She was a cleaner. She knew the weight of things. To her right, on a dusty crate, sat a heavy, industrial fire extinguisher. She didn't scream. She didn't cower. She acted. With a surge of adrenaline, she grabbed the heavy steel cylinder, hefted it with both hands, and swung. She put all her weight, all her fear, and all her desperation into the blow. The cylinder connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening, wet crack. He dropped like a stone, unconscious before he hit the dirty concrete floor. She stood over him, panting, the heavy extinguisher still clutched in her hands. Her arms trembled from the strain. She had crossed a line. She was no longer a witness. She had drawn blood in his war. From the floor, Akio saw it all. He pushed himself to his feet, a look of something akin to awe on his face. The tide of the battle turned as his men rallied, and soon, the last of the Hashimoto soldiers were subdued. They didn't go back to the mansion. Kenjiro took them to a discreet safe house, a minimalist apartment high above the city. The adrenaline faded, leaving them both raw and aching. Noelle had a deep bruise forming on her arm where the man had grabbed her. Akio came to her as she stood by the window, staring at the city lights.
He didn't speak.
He gently took her arm, his thumb tracing the edge of the darkening bruise. His touch was a brand. "This world will stain you, Noelle. he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't decipher. She didn't pull away. She met his gaze, her own eyes clear and steady. "It already has," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I chose to stay. I chose to swing." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, something deeper, passed through his eyes. The confession came then, not a declaration of love, but something more dangerous, more honest. "For 20 years, everyone who has looked at me has seen a monster to be feared or a bank to be plundered," he said, his voice a low whisper. "You are the only person who looked at me and saw a man dying of thirst." He paused, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "That kind of sight is a threat to everything I have built. It is more dangerous than any loyalty I could ever buy." The Hashimoto clan was broken, but its leader, a man named Ryuji, was still at large. And he was desperate. He knew he couldn't beat Akio in a straight fight. So he changed the target. He no longer wanted Akio's territory. He wanted his ghost. He wanted Noelle. The attempt was clumsy but direct. They tried to grab her during a rare, heavily guarded trip to a specialty market to procure a type of tea Akio favored. Kenjiro's men intercepted them, but the message was clear. She was no longer a complication. She was the endgame. The final confrontation was inevitable. Akio planned a decisive strike against Ryuji Hashimoto's last known stronghold and fortified estate in the hills outside the city. He intended to go in, cut the head off the snake, and end the war for good. "You will stay here," he told Noelle in the safe house. "It wasn't a suggestion. Kenjiro and 10 men will remain. You will not leave this room." For the first time, she defied him directly.
"No," she said.
He turned slowly, a dangerous stillness in his posture. "What did you say?" "You need me," she said, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "You think you know that estate, but you only know it as a rival. I know it as a worker."
He stared at her, confused.
"Before I worked for you, I worked for a high-end catering company. We did an event there for Ryuji's daughter's birthday 8 months ago. I was in the kitchens, the service corridors, the loading bays. His security is focused on the front gates and the walls, but his weakness is from the inside. The place is a maze of old service tunnels they don't use anymore. There's a dumbwaiter shaft from the main kitchen that goes directly to the pantry next to his private office. They use it to bring him his late-night meals. It's not on any of the building plans your men have." She had his complete, undivided attention. She, the invisible girl, had seen the one thing his army of spies had missed. She was the key. He didn't want to take her. The thought of putting her in that much danger was a physical pain. But he was a strategist above all else. He knew a winning advantage when he saw one. Her knowledge was the difference between a bloody siege and a surgical strike. She didn't go as a passenger. She was part of the briefing, standing beside Akio, pointing out routes on a blueprint, her voice clear and certain. She guided a small, elite team, including Akio and Kenjiro, through a forgotten service entrance, down dusty, forgotten corridors she remembered from carrying trays of canapes. The plan went perfectly until it didn't. A reinforced steel door, newly installed, blocked the final corridor. It was a dead end. They were trapped. "We pull back," Kenjiro whispered, his gun raised. "No," Akio said, his jaw tight. "He's right," Noelle said, her mind racing. She remembered the layout, the flow of the building. "There's another way," she looked up. "A ventilation grate, large and old. That duct leads to the main cold storage. It runs right over his office." She looked at Akio. "It's the only way." She didn't wait for an order. She found a crate, climbed on top, and began working on the rusted screws of the grate with a knife Kenjiro handed her. She wasn't being rescued. She was creating the path. She led the way into the cramped, dark space, her movements sure and certain. She was the reason they reached Ryuji Hashimoto's office undetected. The end was swift and brutal. Ryuji was caught completely by surprise. The war was over. In the quiet aftermath, amidst the wreckage of his rival's empire, Akio found her. She was standing by a window, covered in dust, a smudge of grease on her cheek. He walked to her, ignoring the bodies, the blood, the victory his men were securing. His world had narrowed to her. He didn't touch her at first. He just looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen before. The cost of the night was evident. Kenjiro had taken a bullet to the shoulder protecting him. The old soldier would live, but it was a stark reminder that nothing in this world came without a price. Akio finally reached out, his fingers gently wiping the smudge from her cheek. "In my world," he said, his voice low and absolute, "debt is paid in blood or loyalty. You have given me your loyalty. Now my life is the payment for that debt." He took her hand, his thumb tracing the calluses that were a map of her old life. "Where you are, I am." It was not a proposal. It was not a declaration of love. It was a statement of fact. A vow carved in steel. It was the most honest thing he had ever said. They stood on the grand balcony of his mansion, overlooking the sprawling, jeweled lights of Tokyo. The city was his again, the silence of his empire restored. Her old life, the smell of bleach and the ache of invisibility, was a distant memory, a ghost from another lifetime. She was no longer Noelle, the cleaner. He was no longer Mr. Tanaka, the myth. They were Akio and Noelle, survivors of a war she had helped him win. She placed her hand on the cold marble of the railing, and he immediately covered it with his own. He didn't pull her closer or say anything else. He just stood with her, a silent, unmovable presence at her side, their fingers intertwined. She wasn't his prisoner, and she wasn't his prize. She was his partner. She looked out at the endless city, a queen surveying an empire she never asked for but had, by choice and by blood, made her own. The silence no longer felt like a threat. It felt like home.